Good afternoon, or buonasera. We're calling in from across the US, and I'm very pleased to be with you as part of the Chersite program. I'm Christina Abate, and I am the founder and CEO of NOVITA Communications, and have worked for the Italian ceramic industry now going on 30 years, and have been to many Chersites. And so we're on the sort of the last countdown week of our next edition of Chersai, and I can't wait to see everyone in Italy again. And I'm honored for Novita to be able to bring together a wonderful panel of industry leaders to discuss sustainability for North America, and as it relates to the Italian tile industry and the future of our practice. So again, I'm Chris, and I lead NOVITA. We're based in New York, and we have offices around the country and global partnership on the PR front. And I'm joined today by Russell Meyer. He's an old friend, a former journalist. He also writes for magazines like Architectural Record. He's currently the global sustainability leader for Woods Bagot. He's trained in both engineering and architecture, and journalism. I think he's great there too. He's had a career focused on progressing sustainability in the built environment to address climate change and the natural environment, social equity and human health, and the application of technologies to architecture, sustainable technologies to architecture. He is very broadly interested in the topic and very knowledgeable, and he has actually worked a bit with us in the past to help us with our sustainability kind of work in the space. And so we're very happy to have him with us in his new role at Woods Bagot. And then Maria Lamonto, and he's been to Chersai, so he's actually been with us in Bologna and at Covering, so he's definitely knows us a lot. And then also Maria Lamonto, who will be coming with us to Chersai in days, is the founding principal of Design Galaxy and GLXY. She's an award-winning interior designer promoting health, wellness, and sustainability. She's Well IP, a Living Future Ambassador, Fitwell Ambassador, and an allied ASID. She'll be the the next coming president for ASID in New York, and has been very involved in a lot of the industry's work on the sustainable side for her clients and the industry at large. She specializes in built environment, commercial and residential, that are healthy, non-toxic, and enlivened by biophilic and sensory design principles. I apologize because it's New York City, and we have ambulances and police cars going by, but hopefully we'll be okay. So I will mute myself when that happens. But so today's topic that we're together to discuss is the ceramic impact on carbon footprints in the built environment. So we, a lot of us that are like tile lovers and enthusiasts realize the impact that ceramic has and can have, and we understand this moment it's becoming more and more important to find materials that are truly like healthy and wise choices for a built space that will last more than 5 years or 7 years, and we understand the impact on the whole building interiors as they change out over the years. So we thought it was really interesting last year when I was in Italy. I was talking a lot about ESGs, which are a rating system or a way of looking at carbon usage within buildings, and which are coming, are being considered because the financial side of a lot of corporations is looking for those ratings or those kind of data analysis to help with getting funding and loans and other things. So it's become a really important topic on the financial side of a lot of companies. And it touches us directly because I think obviously the built environment has a big impact on an ESG rating or status for a company. So we just thought we'd kind of use that lens to look at what's happening in North America right now, what designers are doing. So my first question to my panelists and friends is, what is sort of the state of sustainability and work in the North American market in terms of what you're seeing personally and on a broader context? So I don't know if Russell, you want to go first?
Yeah, sure. I'm happy to start. Thanks, Chris. It's always a pleasure to talk about ceramic tiles and sustainability in the context of Chersai. It's such an exciting time. I mean, the state of the industry, in some ways, it's as confusing as it has always been. It's still being primarily driven by, I think, the sort of the independent green certification systems like LEED and WELL. in California where I live, it's still, or it's predominantly driven by Cal Green, our state green building code that has pretty much just LEED requirements for materials. And so, in some ways, I feel like the industry reflects what it has for the last 10 years. But there's been an explosion of new things I think we'll talk about today that are kind of, we're right at the point of a lot of things becoming very useful and leading us in different directions. I would say that it's still, though, a huge burden for architects when they sit down and try and make heads or tails of what one certification on a product is compared to another and how to evaluate those. I think that's where we're still at. It's still, it's always a question for us on every project we get involved in, is how much time can we really invest on, on rethinking the material palette that we've used from the last project, because I think as designers, we all know we fall back on things we've used, particularly when you're dealing with supply chain impacts that we've all had in the last couple of years due to the pandemic. It's like partly you're just going to what you can get, and especially if it's a material on the critical path, like tile might be for finishes. So I think in some ways things haven't changed. I think the biggest question that I hear, I participate in the AIA's large firm roundtable sustainability committee, and that group is pretty much solely focused on the question of carbon these days. And so I think that, if there's one thing that has changed in the last couple of years, it's the kind of renewed, or I'd say new focus on embodied carbon data. And so people are looking for products that bring that to the table, because it's feeding into larger carbon footprint models. And the AIA 2030 challenge is collecting embodied carbon data now, and firms are trying to meet that. So I think that is probably where we're at right now.
So just to finish, so when they're collecting the carbon data, is that feeding into an ESG, kind of report you're giving them, or is that just,
Well, I think there's still I mean, you could say it's a disconnect. It's also an opportunity, is that a lot of the clients we have, when you get up to the owner side, they have ESG plans, right? They have ESG reports. I think when you get down to, and I won't mention specific clients, but if you're dealing with a large organization with a large portfolio, when you get down to the individual project level and you're working with those owner representatives, that's what I say is that disconnect between what a company's ESG policies might state and how that expresses itself through a material like tile. So if you're collecting an EPD or an HPD and carbon data for a ceramic tile, how does that feed up to a corporate strategy, and how does that help that project team communicate to their leadership, to their management, that they're instrumentalizing that ESG policy? I don't think that companies have quite figured that out. And if you pay attention to the investor side of ESG reporting, there's been a lot of controversy in the last year about whether ESG reporting even matters. I disagree, but I think it's not. There was such a kind of emphasis on ESG for so long, and you saw these big statements from these big investors saying how if you're not talking about climate risk, then I don't want to. I'm not talking to you. And then of course the economy softens a bit and everybody changes their tune. So I don't think it's a surprise to see a little bit of a pushback, not necessarily, what do you call that? Yeah. But I think that's a blip, really.
Interesting. Well, we'll move over to Maria. So, and we just jumped into it. So tell us a little bit about, just what you've been seeing and how you relate to what we just said.
Sure. And I just want to also say thanks for having me here. It's really an honor to be here. So from the interior design side, what I'm seeing is that there is a shift happening that wasn't happening. I think that Russell's standpoint from the architecture side, architects have been involved with sustainability in the United States for much longer than interior designers, because the interior designers are really segmented into a couple groups. Those who work in architecture firms and on the commercial side, but then there's a whole host of designers who are working in small firms, doing both residential and smaller commercial work, and the residential designers who might be solo practitioners. And so what I see happening is that there's a sort of coalescence happening in the industry. And you're seeing it come out when things like the Interior Design Pledge for Climate, for Positive Impact come out. And that's a joint effort between Metropolis Magazine and the American Society of Interior Designers, with the International Interior Design Association and the Canadian Interior Design Association. So you're seeing things sort of come together. And at this point, it's raising awareness and saying we have this responsibility, and bringing it to everyone and trying to get them on board. So in some cases, people are working and trying to specify sustainable materials. But there's also a big push to just simply get that awareness heightened, to get more people looking at this and incorporating it into their practice. And to speak to Russell's point about the sort of the hurdles that people face when trying to select materials, there's a lot of research time that needs to go into it. And when you talk about interior designers who are in small firms or solo practitioners, the time that they have to research materials is very small. They can't afford the time. It's not built into their budgets. It might not be these larger scale projects. And so how do you bring sustainability, material choices in at a smaller scale across the industry? And what's happening to help that is that there are these databases that were formed years ago, and they were very clunky at the beginning. Russell's nodding his head. They were very difficult to work with. And what's happening, it's not great yet, but databases have formed, and then they are merging with each other. And then also they're collaborating with the database Mindful Materials. So what's happening as I look into the future, next year even will be a different landscape for people to specify materials and to look for things, is that the research time will become more streamlined, because what they're trying to do is to harmonize between these databases and harmonize with the industry, so that when people are looking for those the check boxes that they need to meet in terms of sustainability, and it also is the ESGs, it's also affecting it, that they can do it in a more streamlined way. So I'm looking at it more forward-looking, looking towards the future, that we are getting to where we need to be bit by bit. I think that looking at where we are now is still a little frustrating inside the industry.
So Russell, do you want to, that's great. Thank you, Marie. And that is really helpful and important for, I think, the industry and the world to kind of understand these shifts and this information overload that we have. Everyone's getting, there's just so much coming at them, and not that much, there are not enough hours in the day to do everything we need to do. And we want to, I think the design practitioners want to do the right thing. I think a lot of times they fall back on what they used before because they know the vendor, because they know if they, once they find one that they think works, then they'll go back to it. But I think they also creatively want to be able to switch things up, and they have different clients and they don't want their stuff to look the same. So there's also that sort of personal sort of drive to create new spaces with new types of materials. Russell, do you want to speak a little bit about what the AIA, so just recently, their recent announcement and the news there?
Yeah, I mean, Maria kind of alluded to that, and it was a sort of a joint effort by AIA and ASID and many other organizations with Mindful Materials to develop the Common Materials Framework, and that was launched at AIA in June, and they're sort of digitizing that framework. So I think that's due to roll out, I think in November at Greenbuild, I think is their goal. And what that is in a nutshell is it's looking at 5, I hate this word, but they use the term buckets They look at 5 buckets: human health, climate health, ecosystem health, social health and equity, and circular economy. And what they've done is they've taken every kind of independent product label or certification. Think of Living Product Challenge, think of Cradle to Cradle, or FSC certified, or whatever you could think of as and they have created a sort of consistent way to structure those and compare them around certain criteria, right? So you could develop, and I think what I find exciting about that, and I think it's really a challenge for everyone in architecture, is to adopt it. But I think it's exciting that we'll have this consistent approach, because I think that something that we were talking about in the conversations leading up to this was this shift from shift to responsibility from rating systems, and I know we can talk a lot more about that. But I think that in the past, I would see a lot of architecture firms develop a sort of proprietary approach to materials and sustainable materials as a differentiator. And I really see that there's a lot of conversation about the need to sort of set that aside and join forces a bit as an industry. And I do think something like the Common Materials Framework is an opportunity for us to do that if people, really dig into it and start to, rethink their schedules, rethink their specifications, along the lines of that framework. I think that, because ultimately the challenge is working with contractors to get the materials that you want on the project. Right. And if we be consistent and predictable about that and take the guesswork out, so every specification isn't totally different depending on which firm you're working with, I think if we really want change, that's what will drive it.
So will EPDs and HPDs be something that's kind of coming into that lens as well for mindful materials, or is that something that you feel is important to kind of consider still for the companies to still be creating those? And
I definitely do. I think that it's, we were talking about this before about how it's impossible for a company with hundreds and hundreds of products, like a tile manufacturer, to have every product come with its own EPD and HPD. It's just financially impossible. Mm-hmm. And so, so I think that kind of transparency is important. It's important to have a selection of products across a line, I think, for designers to choose from, because sometimes it's, you absolutely have to collect that documentation to meet a client's own sustainability agenda. So I still see those as important. And I think that those are important tools for manufacturers to use, really just to be able to look at where their impacts are within their process, right? And it's consistent. It's not like a voluntary self-reporting type of thing. You're required to report on very specific, criteria. And I think that kind of transparency is still necessary. So even within the Common Materials Framework, all of the reference standards and certifications in there, are all kind of independently verified, and consistent criteria. So I think I don't think anything in there is fuzzy necessarily.
Mm-hmm. That's great. Yeah. Well, thank you for and I think that fact that the AIA and ASID and IIDA are working together, I think that's another kind of great sort of statement about where the industry is moving. I feel there's a lot more collaboration between the associations and ways to work together in terms of the different pieces of the practice. And I think what kind of got me really the juices like flowing was when I went to a session that I saw Maria speak at, where they were talking about the interior side, because I always thought about the carbon impact of a building being its like energy usage and its construction, the cost of like building a building, but then the fact that most buildings are being renovated every 7 to 10 years, and you think about all that sort of product that's coming out and going back in, the actual impact of the interiors piece of the equation is actually very significant over the course of a building's life cycle. So so I think that kind of got me really like thinking like, wow, we really, by having a material like ceramics, Italian ceramics that will last for so long, that have wellness intrinsically, these great intrinsic characteristics, that it's an opportunity for us to like stress or to evaluate or explore that impact, and then also to sort of tell that story of how when a building is being changed out, the industry is looking at the materials very carefully, and then looking at materials that will last past that time and sort of have timelessness to them.
Yeah.
I don't know if there's anything that, I know that Maria's spoken on this several different times. I don't know if there's anything else that you want to add to
Yeah,
that.
it might be worth mentioning that on the interior design side of things, that, you know, just to give a shout out to Metropolis magazine, they've done a lot of work and they've put together an entire segment of their website that is the climate toolkit. And they are actually working to help basically educate interior designers and provide resources. And when they say a toolkit, it's good for its word. They are providing tools to try to make that time that designers put into a project become more streamlined. And their toolkit basically helps people to look at the carbon impact of the materials that are going into the building. And they have lots of links. It's interesting to explore, particularly for those designers who haven't been doing this yet. You know, and I would say, unless an interior designer is working in an architecture firm, it's probably going to be new for them. You know, looking at the carbon impact, but it's being asked of us now from the industry, internally from the industry. I didn't mention before that specifically that ASID, the American Society of Interior Designers, has a task force now. They've got this committee on climate, health, and equity. So they have prioritized this very at the top of their agenda. So it's beginning to take the forefront, you know, and having more people come on board will come. But the tools that are becoming available on the carbon side are also very interesting. And to use them, very often you need an EPD.
Mm-hmm.
You know, you can use common ones, but it's better to have the EPD from the manufacturer. And yes, it's expensive. But I also want to throw in there that for manufacturers to get their products into these databases, as the industry moves forward with this, could be important for getting awareness of their products in front of designers as there's more adoption.
Sounds like it's very important. Yeah, absolutely. You want to, and of course we want our guys, our companies in as many places as possible, but certainly, yes, I think it's really good for us to be aware of what's happening. And I think that also when you break down the term ESG, and we're just using this as sort of an umbrella, because as Russell said, there are these 5 buckets. There's lots of ways to look at this very sophisticated topic, and it's got such amazing impacts across everything that we do. But the S in that equation is social. And I think we spent some time talking a little bit about that, especially with sort of our love of Italians and the way Italians, produce things in general. But I don't know if anyone wants to start us off with the social piece of how important that is for the North American design community, that to any product that someone's specifying.
I always start this off, Chris, by saying, pardon me, I've been in sustainability a long time, so I tend to be very cynical. But when I think if you've been paying attention to climate change and for as long as I have, it's hard not to get cynical from the point of view of architecture, because you feel like you're not, it's like everything's been very incremental. And so it's a very long-term view. But the climate crisis is now. And I think, for a lot of us, certainly from my perspective, during the pandemic, it was really the Me Too movement, and then moving into BLM during the pandemic, there was just a complete shift within, I would say, corporate culture, and certainly corporate architecture culture and design culture, to focus on social impact and the social impact of the work that we do. And starting to see that through the specification of materials and the supply chain of materials. And now I'm not saying that's a new topic, because, when we look back at things, like 20 years ago, the sustainability community was really focused on vinyl and all of the impacts of vinyl manufacturing, right? Now, any material has environmental impacts. So it's not to like pick one from random, but that one in particular, there was a whole kind of industry focus on for quite a while. But I think now the way that we think about it, the models that I see emerging that I'm really excited about on the social side of this are things like the Design for Freedom Toolkit that Grace Farms produced, that really gives you the tools as the designer to start asking some pretty detailed questions of your suppliers, like how much do you pay your staff? Do they have benefits? Can they collectively bargain? Do you use seasonal labor? Do you provide benefits to seasonal labor? Like to me, it's starting to shift. And the reason I started by saying I'm cynical is because, we absolutely have to keep focusing on reducing carbon. But it's clear that the trajectory for climate change is probably a worst case scenario, right? So the impacts will happen, and they will happen to the most vulnerable people. And so I think what toolkits like Design for Freedom do, and you can download all that stuff for free off of the Design for Freedom website, is that it starts to say, okay, well, let's care about the people who are making this stuff. And so when I think about a product like Italian ceramic tiles, having been to Trasai, having been to so many of those factories, it's so clear that they're really embedded in their community, right? And it's not that they just started practicing sustainability in the 90s because it became the thing. No, it's because they're invested. They live and work there. They have for decades, right? And so they're not going to draw the water down. They're not going to overtax the infrastructure, right? Because it's their livelihood. And I think that, when I think about ethical procurement from a design standpoint, it's kind of like when you go to a farmer's market and you meet the farmer who grew the vegetable, right? I think if we're talking about architecture, we're already in a privileged position. And so looking, and I look at a lot of our clients and it's like, I think the role of the designer is to tell these stories to our clients to make it really clear what the value is in that kind of procurement.
That's really well said. Thank you, Russell. That's beautiful. And I agree with that. Ray, do you have anything to add on that point? It's very meaningful. That transparency is meaningful to so many.
Yeah. I don't know if I have so much to add, but I think that talking about the stories of our materials is important. Russell said that it's, there are marketers here that talk about that the way to get adoption and to reach people is through the storytelling, and the stories of those materials. And let's take a different side of the sustainability equation and the material health. Russell talked about that the impact of Italian tile, and that they live there, that you work there, you're not going to be damaging your own community. For many other materials and for other ceramic tile production, that might not be the case. And so looking at the health impact of the communities that surround other materials, Russell mentioned vinyl, the production of that is very chemical heavy, it's toxic, and it affects, and this term in the United States has become more prevalent, fence line communities. 4 years ago, people would not have understood what a fence line community is. And that's the communities that surround manufacturing facilities that are adversely affecting the environment. And then it affects the health if they're off-gassing, if they're getting materials into the groundwater. It affects those communities that live nearby, and that has been unregulated here, and so I actually tap in, we haven't mentioned yet the Healthy Materials Lab. I like to tap into their offerings and their information on their website. And
explain who they are, Maria.
Yes, the Healthy Materials Lab is a an educational department at Parsons School of Design and the New School in New York. They have various different funders who fund them, but their mission, part of their mission, is to basically bring healthy materials into affordable housing across the United States. And they have programs, they've developed these courses that are very accessible, meaning that they're not very expensive, they're online, and they use experts from around the world on the topic of material health and sustainability. And they are there to educate designers to make better choices and to learn about the chemical impacts of, and what that means from many different sides, not just health, but also the social impact of those materials. And one of the things that I was just checking in on their tile page today, and one of the things is they being very careful, and this applies to Italian tile, being very careful about what you're bringing in from other countries into the United States, and being very careful about the glazes, and what goes into the actual ceramics. And there are other countries that are sort of blacklisted because you don't want to buy things from them because of the impact. You don't know about the governance around how these things are being made. You don't know the social impact of the workers, of the laborers. So, it's to look at the story of Italian tile is a beautiful one, in comparison to some of the other places where people get tile from.
She hasn't even been to Versailles yet, so we're gonna see.
Oh, but they see my last name. They know I'm a little biased.
Well, I think that's a really good segue. And the other thing I in the bio of Russell, I really didn't touch on is together we worked on this. It's been a very interesting exhibit called Reconstruct that took place at the Triennale as part of the Broken Nature exhibit that Paolo Antonelli had created. We were the official U.S. pavilion, looking also at life cycle analysis and circular economy. So I don't know if you want to. We were thinking our next thing would be to sort of segue over to governance and looking at things like the ISO, but I don't know if you want to speak a little bit about the life cycle analysis too, Russell, because Russell comes also from Arab and has looked very globally at a lot of the, the issues related to product life cycle.
Yeah, I mean, LCAs have been a really significant driver in terms of thinking about the carbon footprint, and I know we've kind of been starts and stops around policies around LCAs and the construction industry on the West Coast. But we do have a piece of legislation or policy in California now called Buy Clean. It was really a framework or a policy that was developed out of the University of Washington in Washington State. But then they couldn't kind of get it across the line there. But in California, what it was really starting to ask, certainly infrastructure contractors initially, because they were looking at biggest impacts and where the state's really putting its money, and trying to ask the construction industry to do LCAs on all of the steel and concrete that goes into, say, like highways and bridges and these sort of massive projects. And the idea was to just start to create a database of embodied carbon, so we could have a baseline, because I think that's the other sort of challenge is you can do a carbon footprint of a product, but then what are you comparing it to? And what's good, right? And if you say, oh, we improved our embodied carbon footprint by 5%, okay, what does that equate to, right? So I think that carbon is, I don't mean to badmouth carbon. I spend a lot of my day talking about carbon on projects, certainly more on the operational side than embodied. But I think, consumption-based emissions, which is what embodied carbon really is. It's like we're buying products where those emissions occur somewhere else, right? But those emissions occur because of me. And so I think that is a huge issue that's really not very clearly regulated. And so I think that one's going to definitely be a work in progress, and LCA plays a big role in that. And I think that, we've focused on that because that's been the that's been what the investor class has asked companies to report on from a climate risk perspective. But where I think that things, like we were saying about the social impacts playing more of a role in that, I think the governance question then really comes down to how manufacturers and suppliers are managing this, right? So governance doesn't necessarily have to mean policy. So it is great if there are policies happening. I think that that's a much slower process. On the embodied carbon side, I think there aren't that many policies in place around the world. But I think from a governance in terms of how industries are managing this is an important one to look at. And so when you think about Italian ceramic tile, you look at the new ISO standard 17889, which is specifically focused on sustainability processes in relation to ceramic tiles and installations. And so when I look at that, back to the comment we were making about EPDs and HPDs, I'm personally more interested in a tile company that certifies under that standard, that ISO standard, because I know that regardless of what I buy from them, whether they have an EPD or an HPD for that specific line, all of their tiles are being manufactured under that ISO standard because they have to do that to comply with that, right? Now, like Woods Bagot, we're an ISO 14001 company because we have our own environmental management systems in place, right? And a very clear, defined way for how we manage our own projects. And so I know that we're pushing a sustainability outcome on everything we do. And I think, it's not too much to ask a company that manufactures tiles to do the same sort of thing. So I think, to me, I look at that, and I think that is a huge shift to see an industry like that develop a very specific standard to really, to create some consistency and measurability across a very broad industry. I mean, right, even within Italian ceramics, there are dozens and dozens of companies.
Well, and that standard, I think it took like 11 years. It's across like the world. So it was really all producers. They had to kind of, work together. And I think there's been a lot of, pushing each other country to country to sort of, bring leadership in certain areas to other countries to lift us all. And I think that's, again, that spectrum that we're all working on, the fact that a lot of it's open source, we're trying to all move forward together, kind of stronger together, and the associations working together. So I think that's a positive and against your gloom and doom, which I know is happening. It's just there are like bright spots along the way, and I think that's one of them for sure. I don't know, on the governance side, anything that you wanted to add to that, Maria, in terms of things that you're seeing or thoughts around any of that? Like, I think you're right about the ISO standard sort of overarching sort of and rigorous review that goes into something like that. I think that's really positive for the world and for the industries.
Yeah. I just want to comment on what Russell shared about the ISO, that designers really become attached to brands, because of the time that goes into the research to find materials. When you find a company who is functioning with high sustainability standards, part of that research, like Russell mentioned, doesn't have to be done. And for the residential interior designers and the smaller designers, that becomes huge. And there's definite brand attachment. So these ISOs, once they've done the research, it becomes important because then you don't have to do that work over again. And then you have the whole catalog to look at. Of a company's product line. So I just, it's transparency and those standards are just important. I think that's the only comment I have around that, unless there's something I said previously that we're forgetting to bring in.
I think that transparency, and I think we were talking about this a bit on our pre-call about I love the word ethical procurement. I think that's not a word, it's two words, but that expression, because I think that kind of ties into everything, the way things are being made, the way who's making them, how they're living their lives, and then, what they do once they arrive on site with their embodied carbon. Yeah. So I think that's that's all the different pieces of the story. And I do think, I love that the industries are working together. I know that Greenville still happens as a show. I feel like sustainability is not just one moment. It's kind of, it's all, everyone all the time now is looking at it in different levels or different ways. And so I don't know if you're going to say something about that.
Yeah, there's self-governance going on. We had talked about that. Aside from the certification programs that do drive a lot of the decisions at large scale projects, there's also a shift in the industry of self-governance and being driven by people's values, and also the stress that designers feel about their own impact as they learn more. One of the things that we like to say when we're talking to designers and educating them is, once you learn something about the impact, you can't unlearn it. And then you carry that around, and then you're thinking about all those materials that are going to get torn out in 7 years in the hotel you've designed, and what is the impact of that? So, the self-governance is one thing that we're starting to all say, okay, we need to make better choices. But also the schools, I have noticed in the past few years, have begun to incorporate the teaching of sustainability into their curricula. And so not only do the students who are coming through design school right now, are they of an age that they have the climate in mind in a very different way than we might have when we went through school. And Russell, you're excluded because you've been in sustainability for so long. Bless you for that. But now it's different. These students are coming out and they are interested, and they know that the planet is in crisis and they understand this in a different way. And so the sort of the self-governance and the value-driven aspect to this is also considerable as more people come on board.
Russell, do you want to jump in there and say add to that at all? Or?
I mean, I think what Maria says about values, right? It's such it is such a different, I mean, it is a real shift, I think, in the way in what the designer's responsibility is, right? And really making conscious decisions about where you do business. We were talking earlier about modern slavery policies, which I do a lot of work in Australia. We have several offices there, and every company in Australia has a modern slavery policy, and it's real clear. And it's still kind of rare in the States. I mean, global companies tend to, but you'd be surprised at some really big corporations that don't have a clear modern slavery policy. And that's I think that what I see in design is that people don't feel what I want to say. People feel emboldened to ask that question now, right? You would have never thought 15 years ago asking your tile manufacturer supplier if they had a modern slavery policy or who makes their tiles, right? And I think that that's the shift when Maria talks about young people coming into practice these days. They do care about those sorts of things, and social media, we could talk about how awful social media is, but it certainly, allows people to tell their stories. It gives a wider platform for folks to connect. And I think it still gets back to the storytelling, and can you really make a case around the ethical procurement of something like a tile, to not only address carbon, but to address these social needs. And the governance structure just makes it easier to do that, I think, each time. So I don't know. I think that it's an advantage for any manufacturer that can really clearly communicate that story, because once you make that kind of, to Maria's point, I totally agree. Once you make that connection and you've built that relationship, then it's easy to just keep doing it.
Also, because our companies keep coming up with great new products, so you can just kind of stay within the family and but there are so many good ones. And so, I think today, with the time we had in our little Café della Stampa, we should have been drinking coffee. I meant to have coffee, I've had a lot today already, so I'll stop. It's getting late in the day, but oh, you do have your coffee. Nicely done, Russell. So I mean, I do think this is just like kind of touching, you know, just the beginning of this topic. It's an important topic that, as I think a lot of our colleagues around the world will see, is a hot topic for the US and Canada, looking at everything from the smaller practitioner that's doing more residential projects on a scale that might be like 1 or 2 houses at a time, to large corporations and large architectural and design practices that are truly globally practicing in very large commercial spaces and institutional spaces. So it's hitting us in a lot of different ways. And I think, you know, we need to all be part of the solution of the conversation. And I think that's what something like this allows us to do. But I'm hopeful that we'll have more chances to talk. I know Maria will come with us. We have this great sustainability, a new program that Strama Italy is kind of launching, and a part of our website with information. And there'll be really great presentations during Terside that we'll be able to learn from. So we'll all keep learning and talking and being, you know, transparent about what we're, you know, kind of seeing and are passionate about. And hopefully we can have another chat soon, because I just, there's so much more to kind of dig into. I really, really appreciate both of you being with us today, and being part of the Terside story in the ways you have been already. And look forward to seeing you in person soon, I hope. Okay, so thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Ciao, ciao.
Ciao.
Now.
Ciao.